Ravens Vail is a dark fantasy horror anthology podcast that may contain explicit language and thematic elements not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Ravens Vail, a dark fantasy Southern Gothic horror anthology podcast set in the shadowy world of the Deep South. A convergent reality situated around what most of humanity has accepted as the truth. Obscured from human eyes, Ravens Vail is a mystical sanctuary intended to preserve the existence of its immortal inhabitants. The Macquarie, commonly referred to as witches, have been hunted since before written history. The witches of the Highlands fled persecution to a new land that would come to be known as Appalachia. In these parts, you should always be leery of the things that scare witches. The veil is thin tonight, family. Let's see what darkness lies beyond.
Long before the sawmills sang and the rail cars groaned in Appalachia, this land bore a name older than maps and deeds. A whisper carried by the little river, soft as moss and strong as stone. Tuckaleechee. It means peaceful valley, though peace there ain't never been idle. It's the kind that watches, the kind that remembers, a hush that holds tales older than the timbers, older than us, older than even the hills and the hollers themselves. In a place we now call Townsend, Tennessee, but was once called Tuckaleechee Cove, nestled deep in the shadowy embrace of the Smoky Mountains, it has always had more than its share of ghost stories, the kind that grew like ivy along the forsaken home, whispered from generation to generation. Some say the hills remember, that the trees hum with echoes of old voices carried by the wind like restless whispers. But in the earliest years of the 19th century, none gripped the settlement tighter than the legend of Duskmourn Mortuary. Now you see, we have to go back a piece. Duskmourn Manor had been built as a home for the Duskmourn family. And from the very beginning, it had its problems. Duskmourn Manor seemed to be cursed. But after the patriarch of the family, an elder Macquarie named Bartholomew, one of the original 13 founders of Ravens Vail, had been killed, driving off of Rock Corsail, it went to the firstborn son of each generation. Now the Duskmour bloodline never yielded more than one heir. In the quiet places of Tuckaleechee Cove, whispers curled like smoke, winding their way through shadowy chimneys and candlelit parlors. The folks spoke of Elowen Crowder, the old witchy woman condemned by fire, consumed in a frenzy of fear more than a century past. They say her spirit never truly left, that vengeance burns hotter than any pyre ever had. On the night of her execution, the flames licked the sky, greedy and unyielding, but her song clawed through the darkness, long after the fire had finished its work. You see, she didn't scream. She sang and sang, and the hills carried her voice, shrill and defiant, as if the very land itself mourned her passing. The people had believed fire would silence her. Oh, how how foolish they had been. Rumors took root, tangled and unrelenting. Some claimed her bones were never properly buried, that they remained beneath Duskmour's foundation, trapped without prayer or absolution. Others whispered of restless murmurings coming from Duskmourn in the forgotten spaces threading through the cracks in the stone, calling, waiting. And those rumors had been true. Elwyn Crowder had been buried in unconsecrated grounds on the very spot in the center of the tiny village where Duskmourn Manor's foundation had been laid. Once a grand and foreboding estate, Duskmourn Manor had long since surrendered its name to its new purpose. Duskmourn Mortuary. Perched on the outskirts of the developing town, its silhouette, a ghastly specter in the mist, its stone walls burdened by the sorrow of those who entered but never left. For generations, the Duskmourn family had tended to the dead with quiet reverence, preparing them for their final rest with solemn care. The mortuary had been a magical place of passage, a sanctuary where grief was met with hushed benevolence, a threshold between life and oblivion. Folks talked about how skilled the Duskmourns were at their craft, and being Macquarie hadn't hurt. But sorrow is insidious. It seeps into the bones of a place, clinging to every crevice until it no longer merely lingers. It festers. And within Duskmourn Mortuary, something far darker had taken hold. Now, Silas Duskmourn was born into the shadows and silence, inheriting not just the mortuary, but the burdens that came with it. As the only begotten son of Marcus and Della Duskmourn, his fate had been sealed from the moment he took his first breath. He had known no other home, no life, only the unnatural cold halls of Duskmourn, where grief pressed into the stone and the scent of the funeral incense clung to every surface. Places like that were never meant for children. They were meant for mourning, for final farewells and whispered prayers. Yet Silas had been raised among the departed, his childhood spent in dimly lit corridors and cavernous rooms filled with hushed voices and quiet sorrow. And he was hardly built for resilience, thin, frail, with skin so pale it seemed translucent beneath the flickering candlelight. He was as much a wraith as the spirit said to linger within Duskmourn's walls. And despite the many attempts of the Macquarie to mend Silas's deathly constitution, the spells had never took hold, as if the boy had already put both feet in the grave and just held to the lip of the earth, peering back at his family. But whether the house shaped Silas or merely reflected him was uncertain. In the end, it mattered little. Duskmourn Mortuary had seeped into his very bones, binding him with its mournful embrace as surely as it had all those who had come before. And like them, he had nowhere else to go. They say Silas could hear the dead. As a child, He often told his parents about hearing the bodies in the mortuary speaking, and what the bodies told him was almost always right. Marcus and Della came to believe him. Silas had always been different. From the time he could talk, he spoke of whispers that no one else could hear, soft whispers drifting from the still forms in the mortuary. His parents dismissed it at first, chalking it up to a child's overactive imagination. But as the years passed, they could no longer deny the truth. 'Cause what the dead told Silas was never idle chatter. Their voices carried secrets, lost confessions, final wishes, and the truth that would be buried with them. And disturbingly, their revelations were always correct. The missing heirloom, the undiscovered letter, and the cause of death that had puzzled doctors were all resolved by Silas's inexplicable knowledge. His parents, although skeptical at first, were forced to confront the impossible. How could their son know things that had never been spoken aloud? How could a child, untouched by the world's cynicism, have access to knowledge that should have remained locked away in silence? Over time, they stopped questioning. They stopped doubting. Silas heard the dead, and the dead had much to say. They had once arranged for Helen Ashworth to come and talk to Silas about their shared abilities. But both started to keen loudly as the spirits gathered round them. The walls rattled with the reverberation of the dead demanding attention from the two gifted people. Both fell unconscious. And when they woke up in different places, carried to their beds by loved ones, everybody agreed it was best they stay that way. Silas inherited the mortuary at the tender age of 20, thrust into the business not by choice, but by tragedy. His parents, Marcus and Della, met their untimely end one fall evening at the hands of Caleb, the down drunk, who took their lives over a few miserable pennies Marcus carried in his pocket. He attacked both from behind with bottles of shine he had emptied. Even the McCory don't have the power to stop that. The townsfolk mourned. Silas did not. He had embalmed them himself. A labor of love, or perhaps a final act of detachment. He took his time, ensuring every detail was flawless. Marcus's face was strong in repose, a look he had never had in life. His full frame pressing the sides of his casket. Silas spent meticulous hours building a corpse into the father he had imagined, rather than the one who had loved him unconditionally. Marcus looked strong enough to protect in that casket, instead of just strong enough to love a sick child with gifts beyond understanding. And the folks whispered that Della had never looked more radiant, her peaceful expression betraying none of the horror that had led her to that table. Silas took pride in his work. She was his masterpiece, the very definition of femininity. She filled out her dress in a way that others felt was a little more than their memories told them she should. Her lips fuller, and her makeup more like the young women Silas knew in Ravens Vail. Her hips rounder, and her arms looked like they were meant for holding. Her hands were placed oddly above and below her belly, as if caressing an empty womb. Now as for Caleb, fate was quick and merciless. The man was found dead in his jail cell a month later, stiff and cold as the body Silas worked on daily. Officially, it was ruled a heart attack. But the coroner hesitated when recounting the scene. He swore Caleb's face was twisted in terror, his wide, vacant eyes staring at something unseen. And Silas? He carried on. Methodically, precisely, untouched by the whispers that crept through the settlement like a chilling wind. When he worked on a body, his hands worked with quiet precision, embalming the departed with a reverence that masked the modicum of enjoyment that only occasionally escaped the subtle tug at the left corner of his mouth as it ever so slightly edged into an imperceptible smile. A decade later, Silas Duskmourn disappeared. He had been the last in the family line, a gaunt, peculiar undertaker. The locals never truly trusted him. His vacant stare unnerved even the hardest of men. His silence crawled over people's skin like something unclean. One autumn, 2 nights before All Saints' Day, Silas just vanished. No farewell, no footprints in the soil, no body. There really wasn't an investigation. The Millers had lost a baby to the cough, and Silas never came to collect the body. No one had seen Silas, except when he came to pick up the bodies or to open the doors for mourners in 10 years. The quiet man, the dead boy, the death keeper were all names the people used to avoid his given name. The folks of Tuckaleechee Cove feared that by saying his name, you'd call him to come for your body in the morning. In Duskmourn, the past refused to fade, and the dead were never quite gone. The mortuary now stands in eerie silence, its doors sealed and forgotten, a relic of grief and fear. The iron gates, once proud sentinels, now sag under the weight of rust and neglect, their jagged edges whispering tales of abandonment. Yet the town never truly let Duskmourn fade from memory, nor the horrors entombed within its walls. The locals speak in hushed tones of the mortuary's unsettling preservation, while the land around Duskmourn was devoured by time and disuse. The mortuary itself remained unblemished, untouched, frozen in the moment Silas vanished. No dust coats its surfaces, no cobwebs drape its corners. It's as if the building itself refuses to acknowledge the passage of years and is just waiting for Silas to return. Yet no one dares cross the threshold. Fear clings in the air around it, thick and suffocating. Shadows coil in its corridors, and in the dead of night, whispers, faint and weaving, seeping through its walls. Some even say it breathes, that it listens, waiting. Because despite its decline, Duskmourn has never truly been abandoned. And since Silas's disappearance, the townsfolk won't go near Duskmourn. The first whispers of Duskmourn's long-buried secrets stirred when Elias Wren wandered into town, a drifter with no roots, no past worth recalling, and no future worth planning. The folks had seen his kind before, men who passed through like autumn leaves on the wind, here one day and gone the next. Yet Elias lingered longer than most. He worked odd jobs to scrape together whiskey money, slept in the lean-to in the woods behind the tavern, and always left a trail of dust wherever he stepped, as if the road itself clung to him. It was on a quiet evening, under the flickering glow of the tavern's oil lamp, that Elias broke the careful silence that had kept Duskmourn undisturbed for years. His voice was low and edged with regret, as though the words had escaped his lips before he could catch them.
I saw something at the old mortuary,
he murmured. The room froze. Martin Mason, the barkeep, halted mid-pour, the amber liquid trembling at the bottle's lip. No one spoke. No one moved. The air thickened, charged with something unspoken, something old. Elias leaned forward, grinning, revealing teeth rot-stained from years of whiskey and regret. His eyes gleamed not with fear, but with something reckless, something dangerous.
a light in the window,
he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Still the silence held. No one wanted to ask, to press, to know, but Elias was never the sort to heed caution. He was the kind of man who chased the unknown, who stepped beyond the boundaries common sense built for wiser souls. So, as if daring fate itself, he mused aloud.
Maybe I'll go take a look.
He staggered out of the tavern that night, drunker than any sailor on leave, and vanished into the night, never to be seen again. By morning, the town awoke to an unsettling sight. His withered bag lay abandoned just inside Duskmourn's rusty gates. His coat draped like an offering over the corroded bars. Yet Elias himself was nowhere to be found. No footprints marked his passage, no sign of a struggle marred the earth. And that evening, as the wind weaved its mournful wail into a mighty storm, the townsfolk swore they heard his screams, his voice muffled, pleading from behind the mortuary's doors. His bag and coat were weathered to dust from the season, but they were never touched or moved by the folk of Tuckaleechee Cove. And then there's the tale of Margaret Pruitt. 20 years or more after Elias Wren, for 10 years, Margaret had lived in the quiet shadows of grief, tending to her husband's grave with an unwavering devotion of a woman who had long accepted sorrow as part of her being. The townsfolk had grown used to her solitary presence in the cemetery, a fixture of loss and loyalty. But something shifted one crisp autumn evening. The change was subtle at first, with a relentlessness in her posture and a distant look in her tired eyes. On a chilly night, just before Halloween, Margaret stood at the edge of Duskmour's lot, staring at the grand building with a gaze that seemed to reach beyond its walls. The mortuary was abandoned. Long whispers about its tragic history, a place people passed without lingering, Only a dozen of the oldest people Margaret had ever met were young children when Silas was last seen. Yet Margaret remained there, transfixed, her lips moving as though she were talking to someone unseen. When a neighbor happened upon her and gently inquired about her presence, she barely seemed to register his concern.
"He's inside,"
she murmured. The neighbor hesitated.
Who?
Margaret did not blink. Her voice hollow and sure.
"My husband."
She claimed to have heard him calling her. His voice, unmistakable, lacing through the wind and the brittle leaves. The neighbor, unsettled by her conviction, urged her away, offering reassurance and guiding her back home. But whatever had stirred in Margaret that night did not fade. It had taken root. She returned again and again and again until the morning after Halloween. Only footprints set deep into the rain-slicked muck and moldering leaves remained, leading to Duskmourn's doors, never away from them. Margaret's disappearance sent ripples through the town, unsettling the quiet order of daily life. At first, there was disbelief. Many assumed she would return as she always had, perhaps shaken, but unharmed. But as the hours stretched into days, unease turned into action. The townspeople gathered in small, wary groups, forming search parties that combed the cemetery, the streets, and the outskirts of town, calling her name into the silence. They retraced her last known steps, their lanterns flickering in the autumn air as they hesitated at the edge of Duskmourn Mortuary's property. The mortuary loomed before them, swallowing the light, its windows dark and unyielding. Few dared approach. Its reputation had long been enough to keep people at bay, but Margaret's footprints had led to the front door, and they had looked over every inch of the town. Despite their hesitation, a few among them dared to step forward, pushing open the heavy doors as it groaned in protest, its rusted hinges aching from years of neglect. They expected dust to billow, cobwebs to drape the corners and ceilings, decay to greet them like a living thing shambling towards them. But the air inside, though still, was undisturbed. The room beyond was eerily pristine. The entry hall had bouquets on either side of the plush velvety carpet resting on fine oak tables, full in bloom as if cut from a spring garden. The wood panels at waist height with a chair rail ran the full length of the hall to fine oak doors, freshly oiled and rich with color of dark stain. A single jacket with narrow shoulders hung in the corner on a tall coat rack. Not a speck of dust marred the surfaces. No debris littered the floors. It was as if time had stopped within those walls, preserving everything in unnatural perfection. The silence pressed against them, heavy and expectant as if the house itself had been waiting. They called her name, at first a tentative whisper, then louder, their voices pressing against the silence. The sound rippled through the house, brushing against the velvety carpets and painted walls before dissolving into the vast emptiness. as though the very air conspired to keep her hidden. They moved carefully, their footsteps steady as they searched every room. All of them shared glances as they realized the sounds of their own footsteps were swallowed up by the quiet. Beyond the oak doors of the entry hall, the grand staircase rose before them, its polished wood gleaming even in the dim lantern light, solid and unyielding beneath their weight. They ascended, peering into the corners where the shadows gathered thickest, where the light seemed reluctant to reach. But there was nothing. No forgotten belongings, no disturbed surfaces, no sign Margaret had ever stepped inside at all. Only the unnatural, perfectly embalmed stillness stretched on, unbroken. As the day wore on, speculation and fear wove through the town. Some whispered that she had simply wandered into the woods beyond Duskmourn and lost her way. Others believed she had chosen to vanish, following that voice only she could hear. But more than a few spoke in whispered tones of something else, that Margaret had answered a call not meant for the living. Her grief and inner wishes opening a door that mortuaries allow the living to peer at, but not through. That night, the town settled into an uneasy silence. The search had yielded nothing, no trace of Margaret beyond the footprints at Duskmourn's door, no explanation for her vanishing. The unease hung in the air as the townsfolk locked their doors and lit their lamps, unwilling to let the darkness in. A few went so far as to relight their jack-o'-lanterns, just in case Stingy Jack had decided to come back round. But just as the full moon reached its highest point, a scream tore through the stillness. It was unmistakably Margaret's voice, raw with terror. It echoed through the streets, twisting around rooftops, slipping beneath doorways, rattling through walls. Those who heard it froze, breath caught in their throats, skin prickling with fear they could not name. Some rushed to their windows, scanning the night for movement. Others flung open their doors, lanterns in hand, running towards Duskmourn. But the house stood as it had before, silent, undisturbed. The scream had come from within. There was no doubt, but the night had swallowed it whole. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the silence returned, heavier than before. The wind did not stir. The world felt as though it were holding its breath. No one spoke. No one dared. Now, a few decades later, at the turn of the 20th century, a few years before Townsend would be chartered, there was poor Daniel Harlow. Daniel never believed in ghosts. He scoffed at the whispers, the warnings, the chilling tales passed down through generations like cautious prayers. Duskmourn Mortuary was nothing more than an abandoned relic, a place where time had collapsed in on itself, leaving only dust and forgotten stories behind. So when his friends dared him to step inside, he laughed, shaking his head at their trembling voices and uneasy glances. They shoved him forward, expecting him to push through the heavy wooden door, but the entrance held firm, its iron lock unyielding, the structure undisturbed despite the years.
Guess I'll have to improvise,
He muttered, turning towards the nearest window. The glass was smeared with age, streaked with grime, time pulling the ancient pane towards the bottom of the sill where the top was as thin as it could be and still be intact. Daniel picked up a rock from the lawn, weighed it in his hands, then hurled it forward. The impact shattered the silence first, then the window itself. Shards rained down onto the floor inside, and the jagged edges left a gaping wound in the mortuary's facade. Daniel grinned. Hoisting himself up onto the sill and swinging his legs over, he landed lightly, brushing stray glass from his sleeves. The silence was immediate. No wind, no cicadas, no crickets, no distant hum of the small town behind. Just stillness, heavy and unnatural. The air was still, untouched by time or neglect, carrying only the faintest trace of something distant, something forgotten, but not gone. Embalming tools lay abandoned neatly in their trays, their polished surface catching slivers of dim evening light, waiting in silent testimony to careful hands and precise work. The walls held echoes, not of ruin, but of memories, whispers creeping through the stillness. He exhaled, the sound too sharp in the hush, like an intrusion in a place meant for silence.
See?
He called, his voice breaking against the empty space, scattering in thin, wavering echoes.
Nothing.
But nothing was never truly nothing. Something lingered. It listened. It remembered. Then something moved. Not a shadow, not a shape, just something, a presence, coiled and waiting. Daniel's flashlight sputtered, its beam casting jagged shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls. The eerie flicker unsettled his friends, sending them into a frenzy. With panicked laughter and hurried footsteps, they bolted towards the comforting glow of the streetlight, towards the promise of safety. But Daniel hesitated, and a stubborn streak ran through him. He needed to prove, if even just to himself, that he wasn't afraid. Besides, he had heard something. A voice? A whisper? It drifted down from upstairs, curling around him like a beckoning hand. Someone or something was calling him. His logical mind insisted it must be just one of his friends hiding, trying to scare him. A prank, a stupid joke. After all, it was Halloween, and they had been talking about this trip for the whole summer. And mysteriously, Tom had suddenly been told to stay home with his younger sister. They'd probably made the whole story up just for this. His pulse quickened as he placed his foot on the first step. The old wood groaned under his weight, and then he was at the top of the steps. The sound had come from the room at the very end of the hall. He crept forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, his breath shallow, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. If they wanted to scare him, he'd turn the tables. He'd be the one to catch them off guard. At the threshold, he paused. A sudden chill wrapped around the back of his neck, prickling his skin, raising the fine hairs on his arms. The door loomed before him, slightly ajar. He swallowed hard, then swung it open in one swift movement, ready to shout, ready to laugh, but what he saw drained the warmth from his body. An old woman stood before him, her flesh marred with burns, chars, and crackling like brittle parchment. Her hollow, unblinking eyes bore into his, filled with something ancient, something lost. Elwyn Crowder. The name thundered in his mind, an echo of whispered tales, of warnings, of ghosts that should not be disturbed. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee, to tear himself away, but he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor. His breath hitched, his pulse pounded in his ear, and she took a step forward. Ever so often, a traveler, curious, reckless, or simply lost, dares to ask about Duskmourn Mortuary, about Elwyn Crowder, or about Silas Duskmourn. The townfolk never answer outright. Their voices slip into hushed whispers, their weary glances flicker towards the mortuary, as if Duskmourn itself is listening, as if the silence holds its breath, and beneath the floorboards and the beams, something stirs, something older than memory, something that does not sleep, sinister, patient, waiting. Well, alrighty, family. If you're still listening, it means the veil ain't closed just yet. We hope this haunting Halloween tale stirs something deep in your bones, something old, something relentless. Crafting these stories, stitching them together with whispers and warnings, is a sacred joy for us. And knowing you're out there, leaning in close by lantern light or tucked beneath quilt and shadow, makes the telling all the sweeter. As the wind picks up and the ridgeline vanishes into fog, we take comfort in the company of those brave enough to walk the crooked path to Ravens Vail. Thank you for setting a spell with me. May your Halloween be steeped in mystery, wrapped in wonder, and touched by just enough fear to keep the fire burning. But before you go, a little Appalachian warning. Remember to never whistle in the woods after dark. Some say it's a spirit. Others say it's older than that. If you hear your name called from the trees, don't answer. It ain't who you think it is. And if the woods go all quiet all at once, leave. Something's listening or hunting. Till next time, family, keep your eyes sharp, your heart steady, and your door latch tight after sundown. Happy Samhain. Pleasant dreams. Now, family, you adults have a few chores to do. Go on over to ravensvail.com and see about doing your chores on social media. Follow us on all the social media platforms that we've made available just for you folks. Like, listen, subscribe, and follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you don't mind, leave us a good rating and a kind comment. You can find the Ravens Vail Podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and if you haven't already, just search for Ravens Vail Podcast, and again, make sure you hit the follow button to stay up to date with our latest episodes.
This special Halloween episode of the Ravens Vail Podcast is a production of Small Raven Media. Today's story was written and directed by Ed and Jeryd Bolden-Greer. The narrator for this episode was Ed Bolden-Greer. The voices of Daniel and Elias were performed by Jeryd Bolden-Greer. The voice of Margaret was performed by Starla Blew. Audio engineering and sound design by Nick DeFan at Nicky D Sound. Copyrighted 2025, Small Raven Media. All rights reserved.